denigrated. And to a certain respect, history really for a lot of the trade union movement, labour movement on the left, begins with the Chartists in 1830 and 1840. Everything happens before that's kind of irrelevant and not really important. In fact, somebody said to me in a meeting about Captain Swing, said, well, you know, it's a bunch of starving labourers, you know, why are you interested in that? Well, as far as I understand, I'm sure that Karl Marx, who's sitting here now, probably say, well, class struggle is quite important. You know, you shouldn't ignore things because they don't fit the model, and you certainly shouldn't ignore things because, you know, I mean, history's history. You can't just sweep away whole bits of history and say, well, you know, I'm not making any comment about whether those tactics were the right thing to do, but they're certainly something we should be aware of. And finally, there's a problem of politicization, which is that, you know, often these events like Swing, 1831 in Bristol, are perceived as being apolitical, okay? And that certainly fits in with the idea that, you know, it's chaos, they burned the city down. They didn't really know what to do. In fact, somebody argued, a local historian, an academic historian in Bristol, who's actually somebody we've got to speak before, said that, well, Bristol wasn't really a radical place in the 1830s. It didn't have any reading clubs or radical clubs. So there were no like radical clubs where people sitting around knocking out leaflets. And that's why Bristol wasn't radical. Well, you know, class struggle goes a little bit further than a few smoky reading rooms as far as I'm aware. So this problem of politicisation is very interesting because it's how things are perceived. And if you look at an event and think, well, that's apolitical, then you won't find the things you're looking for. And in fact, with Swing, we're starting to find more and more stuff about that it was actually very politicised, perhaps Republican. Similarly with Peterloo, you look a bit deeper than the kind of narrative of labour history, and you find that there's insurrection in there, there's republicanism, there's all sorts of ideas floating around the organised working class. There's stockpiling weapons. This is not something that fits in with that narrative. So finally, I'm going to conclude, because I've gone on too long probably, I'm not happy. Yeah. Alright, so you want to show the next slide, Rich? Okay, so hopefully I've sort of exposed some hidden histories about some of these events, tried to counterpose them so you can sort of see the differences between them. You have to take my word for it. If you've never heard about these events before, they're understood quite differently in Britain. And I've also talked about these distorted histories. I've also brought up this question of class struggle in many forms. As I said, you know, there's a tendency within the left to believe that, like, it starts with the formation of trade unions. In fact, somebody said to me, the working class there was no working class until you had trade unions, which is kind of a very strange idea, but I think it certainly dominates some of that thinking. Until you've got trade unions, they're not really interested. They're not even a working class, really, because they haven't actually become a class for itself. Also, it's about agency as well. You know, agency means, like, you know, the fact that people can actually make some decisions without actually being told by outside what to do, or by outside forces. And agency figures a lot in these events. Like, and I won't talk about that too much now. But finally, hopefully, I've demonstrated that the fact a lot of these people weren't actually victims, which is the way they're portrayed. Certainly in Peterloo and Tolpuddle. In fact, there's a good story about Tolpuddle, just to finish, right? When one of the Tolpuddle martyrs, one of these trade unions, early trade unions, was sent to Australia, okay, he arrived and he was put on a kind of plantation somewhere, I think probably in Tasmania, Van Diemen's Land, I think. And when he arrived there, Hospital of Rude got some really interesting information because this Tolpuddle martyr arrived and they went, oh, you're one of the Dorset machine breakers. That's what they said. We've got loads of them here. So I'm sure he ran into some of his mates there, people he knew, maybe from other villages or other towns. So what I'm trying to get there is the idea that, you know, perhaps these Tolpuddle martyrs weren't so much martyrs after all. In fact, 3 years before, they may have been in one of those swing mobs who was going around extorting the wealthy, breaking machines and burning haystacks and buildings down to try and increase their wages. So we have to be a little bit careful about bracketing these people as victims. They may have ended up as victims in 1834, but the real victims were from the swing riots of 1830. In Peterloo, we might not be talking about innocent civilians cut down, we might be talking about guilty insurgents cut down by a ruling class who reacted before they left it too late. And that's it. So I won't take long, probably. So anybody got?
Thanks, that was really great. So was there any stories about what happened in Australia, what all these, in terms of insurrection on the plantations, or what happened when all these rebels were transported?
Well, I would definitely suggest, I would definitely suggest read the Captain Swing book, because what's great about Hobsbawm and Roulet's history of Captain Swing is they don't stop with the point where these people are transported. They actually carried on doing research about all these people who were sent into Australia. And they come up with various different conclusions. I mean, one of the conclusions was said that interestingly, that these swing rioters, these evil incendiaries, these like demons of the countryside who beat and threatened people to get money. In fact, they were they weren't unruly prisoners. In fact, they were seen as very honourable men. So that kind of turns things on its head a bit, because that would suggest to me that perhaps these people weren't the criminals, or the way they were perceived as criminals. They weren't actually criminals. They're actually a bit more sussed out, a bit more politicised than perhaps we imagined. They had a whole series of values basically. Kind of that idea that really says, well, actually they weren't, they didn't end up in all sorts of criminal activities. I would definitely read that section to find out a bit more about what happened in Australia. But they certainly chart them, chart all these groups of people, these hundreds and hundreds of people who were sent there. And, they look on, they see what happens to them, whether some of them came back. The interesting thing is that Tolpuddle Martyrs actually came back from Australia after this big campaign. But they didn't stay in England. I don't think they could really go back to their villages. They came back in about 1837 or something. So you're not going to correct me on that. But when they came back, they ended up in Canada, which is where a large number of rural labourers were sent after the swing riots. As a kind of adjunct to the transportation and all that misery, one of the most interesting things that happened after swing was that two or three changes were made. What the authorities realised was that they had large numbers of rural labourers running around who were who were effectively becoming overmanned, so they became surplus to requirements of local, sort of industrialisation of agriculture. So you had, rural labourers' wages going down, and they were trouble, and obviously trouble in 1830-31. So the authorities came up with several plans. One of them was assisted repatriation. So the authorities, well, how do we deal with all these bloody unemployed labourers, causing all this trouble? So what they did was they offered the money to go to Canada. So a large number of these labourers were actually shipped out of counties around London and sent to Canada. In fact, that's where the Tolpuddle Martyrs ended up. They ended up in Canada. So it was kind of early program. The other thing they did, which is something most people in Britain don't know, do you have allotments here? Allotments? Somebody describe what they are? What's that?
Gardens rented off the municipal authorities?
Yeah, they're kind of...
Gardens.
What's that?
Urban gardens.
Urban gardens, yeah. You kind of get a little bit, you can apply to get a little bit of land, so you can grow vegetables and things like that, and they have plots and allotments around Britain. That comes partly from the swing riots, because the problem they had was this sort of starving labourers have been dispossessed of the land, they're proletarians, if the wages go down, they've got nothing, they're finished, So they suddenly thought, oh my God, you know what we've got to do? We've got to give them some land back. Take all the land away from them. They decided to give it back, a little bit back, so they didn't starve. So allotments in Britain, this thing that people really regard as kind of their right, to have a little bit of land, you can apply to the council to get it, or rent it a little bit, actually come from the swing riots. So there were a lot of consequences from the swing riots, which I haven't gone into in detail. I mean, certainly threshing machines were kind of, Hobsbawm and Roulet argued that threshing machines were actually banned or not allowed to be used, effectively, because of the swing riots for about 20 years. So they actually halted capitalist sort of industrialisation of agriculture in that particular sort of that particular facet of agriculture. So they were kind of successful. They actually stopped. The Luddites perhaps weren't, but the swing rioters actually had an impact. They certainly held their own for about 10 or 20 years. They protected themselves by stopping the use of threshing machines. And that's not happened many times in history, I would argue, where kind of industrialisation has been stopped. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but definitely read the Captain Swing and read about Australia and get an idea about what happened afterwards.